Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. From keynote to moderator, there are many hats that you wear in a smart community, and this is the second hat that I'll be wearing for today. As you all know, my name is Abbas Hirji. I'm the lead of the siberXchange Advisory Committee, and I also work at Durham College. Once again, you're joining me from the beautiful St. Francis Center here in the town of Ajax. This land belongs to the people of the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island First Nation, and is protected under the Williams Treaties. I want to thank Mayor Sean Collier and his team, who are actually going to be joining me in the next panel, for making this happen in the new normal. As all of you know, this is the first of its kind cybersecurity studio in the world. I also want to commend Maddie and his team for the last 5 days. They've been working tirelessly for these transmissions and have given us a new opportunity to engage in the new normal on new and innovative topics. The topic that we're about to discuss is on transit. A nascent individual in the world of understanding transit like myself ultimately asks, what do we mean by transit? What's the difference between transport and transit? Go back to the keynote that I delivered, where I said that there's the element of the individual and the collective. Transport, you make individual decisions. You decide which car you want to buy, or in my case, my wife decides which car I want to buy. But in the case of transit, we have to do it collectively. There are multiple stakeholders, multiple pockets, multiple types of use cases that we have to take into account. The idea, or rather an idea, is a thought in transit. Let that settle in as I introduce you to our panelists today. You know, a couple of days ago in one of the power hours, I made a statement where I said, I quoted Dr. Abdul Kalam, who's a well-known figure from India, where he said, you know, dreams are not happen when you sleep. Dreams are what do not let you sleep. The panel members that I'm about to introduce you to, trust me, they have a lot of dreams and they do not sleep. Transit is something that's top of their mind. Let's hear from them about their thoughts, starting with Chris Gillis. Chris, could you introduce yourself, your role, and in your perspective, tell the audience, what do you think transit means?
Okay. Thanks, Ali, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. My role at Durham College is the Manager of Applied Research Business Development, and I work with people like yourself and others. And fundamentally, I go out into the community and I find usually small and medium-sized businesses that have some sort of a technical challenge in an area that we're developing. In this case, could be autonomous vehicles. And then I sort of am the matchmaker that puts them together with the expertise, the funding, and we put a project together. So interesting when you talk about transit, and more, I think that whole notion of transit is morphing into things that maybe we haven't thought of before. We see more and more the notion of mobility as a service. Yep. And so I think what we're starting to really see is this notion of people have to get from A to B, and we used to think of transit maybe, or you said transport, as kind of a unidimensional type thing where you got in a car or on a bus or a train. And more, I think what we're starting to see is it's going to include all of those things. For sure. And we're going to need these solutions that are all-encompassing. So a really interesting time, I think, that we're moving into with this whole subject.
Speaking of this aspect of, thinking of transit as a singular element versus a plural, ultimately it's the context within which transit operates. And I'll turn over to a friend, but also a mentor, Mark Dillon, to not only have him introduce himself, but explain a little bit about his work and how he thinks about transit, not just in any community, but within a smart community. Mark?
Thanks, Ali. It's wonderful to be here, and I'd like to comment this is a nice experience, which is different than sitting in my office behind my computer, so that's appreciated. I'm currently the VP of IT for Waterloo North Hydro, and I also teach cybersecurity at a local college. And I've done a lot of thinking about this because I've been fascinated about it for a while. I've done a fair bit of work in the intelligent community space, so we're talking about connecting things and people. And to me, that's what transit really is. It's about connecting people, connecting them with each other, or connecting them with the goods and services that they need. And the components we look at are the actual technology, the vehicle itself, the infrastructure. And those two things are evolving. They're evolving to be able to make decisions on their own. And they are already making a lot more decisions than you think. We already have, excuse me, We already have infrastructure to vehicle communication, and we already have vehicle-to-vehicle communication in some sense. And the vehicles are making a ton of decisions in your best interest. And the evolution I think we're going to see is removing the responsibility away from the people to get to each other and to get the goods to each other. And there's certainly a lot of cybersecurity challenges there in an industry that traditionally didn't think of itself as a computer industry.
And I want to work with that just a little bit as an industry that didn't think of itself as a computer industry. My next panel member is someone who, and I'll say this to the audience, you all know my role at the AI Hub, the Center for Cyber. One of the core engines behind our success and our growing success has been my next panelist. And for nothing else but giving us the idea, giving us the investment, and us paying back with trust and delivering. Before he introduces himself, I will provide one context, is if we build from what Mark Dillon said about, we never really thought about cars from an ICT perspective and an information communications technology perspective. Same ways with the CIO. We often thought that the CIO was somewhere in the basement, just made sure that the servers were up, the information technology was working, and that's that. But over the last few years, here in Durham region, he's played a pivotal role in the smart cities conversation. And I actually met him in my second month of work at the Durham Smart Cities. Kalyan, can you introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit of how the role of the CIO is now thinking about transit?
So just to introduce myself, my name is Kalyan Chakravarthy, and I know it's very difficult to pronounce, so I go by KC, like the KC and the Sunshine Band, because when I say KC, people started writing emails to me as CASUY, so I just wanted to clarify that. So first of all, I really want to congratulate siberX for doing this amazing. Last week has been phenomenal, and a great shout out to you, Ali. Like, you have been tirelessly working. I don't know whether you slept or not, but like an amazing job.
I'm dreaming, not sleeping.
That is an amazing job. So coming back to the, I'm the CIO for region of Durham, and when I look at it, like the CIO role has changed in a lot of ways. It is the traditional definition of a CIO role is a chief information officer, but like now it is changing to a chief innovative officer, and like maybe this is a chief intelligence officer, where like we are looking at doing how can we do the things in a smarter way, and how can the technology enable in delivering the services by the business. So it is as simple as that. Like nobody has, like I work with, I agree with Mark saying that nobody from transit would have thought like 10 years ago that like this will be so integrated with IT, because it was just a mode of transport from point A to point B. And in my opinion, a transit is something like an ecosystem. It's not the vehicle that we are talking about. It is an ecosystem that is built around, that is helping people for moving from point A to point B, from a source to destination. And this can't just be done by just one vehicle or a suite of vehicles, but like it is about, we need to build that whole ecosystem to really make it work.
On that topic of ecosystems, we'll go to Mark, and we'll start off the conversation around the topic and the title that we have. It's called Securing Smart Transit and Safety Around Smart Transit. Going back to our discussions at my keynote, is that security is not just about the technical element. It's a psychological, a community-based initiative. There are a lot of different aspects to security. The first one that I want to talk to you about is the role of partners specifically from the federal perspective and the provincial perspective. Justin Trudeau often talks about transit, where he says it's not just about we invest in building better homes, invest in building better roads, invest in creating more jobs. We invest in getting transit to get you to those jobs. What is the criticality of ensuring that government is at the table when we're talking about securing the future of smart transit? Mark?
So I think that it's extremely critical, because what we're going to see is the technology is already there. These things already work. We've seen dozens of pilots, whether they have their own exclusive road or they cohabitate with human pilots, and we'll get resistance. We'll get resistance from the public. We'll get resistance from specific areas that think that it's not a good idea. And it's because they don't feel they have a voice. They don't feel they have a stake to control what ends up being out there. Creating some kind of governance for the manufacturing, the supply chain, and how the decisions will be made is going to be critical, because it won't happen in a consistent standard way. And then we'll end up having pockets of good and bad, and it will take either a disaster or some kind of correct perception, some kind of prediction that was, I knew that was going to happen. And we don't want to go to that place because this technology could be a tremendous enabler of unburdening us of some of the things that come with traditional transport.
Right. And I think if we work with that aspect of, the traditional way of thinking about transit where, you get your car and you get to where you need to get to, obviously that's shifting. And Chris, you've played a fundamental role in not just ensuring that we have government stakeholders, other elements of government, other bodies such as Ontario Centres of Excellence, other similar bodies that you've brought them to the table. Has their role been primarily, here's some funding, go and do what you need to do? Or have you been focused on shaping advisories? You've been running some series as well. Talk to us a little bit about the science behind your engagement.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's obviously funding is an important aspect of all of this sort of stuff, but more and more I think it's those other voices in all of this. It's interesting when I first got involved in this and started to think about it, and I would ask people because primarily we were trying to develop projects, talk to them about what we're trying to do, and could we do a project to help them with a challenge? And I tended to get this lights are on but no one's home look, and I realized that I was actually asking them a question that they didn't have an answer to. And so bringing these different groups really in and having them look at things like, what is a public perspective? What is, say, a policing perspective? How are the police going to really manage when we have these sort of automated type things happening? Right. That's an interesting thing to look at. Municipalities are interested in the infrastructure that they need to play. So there is definitely a technical aspect. And I think there's also a very, very large public education aspect of this. Like many, many new things as they emerge, you get a lot of maybe misperceptions, certainly within different groups in the public, and maybe rightly so, fear about how things might move forward. And so I think there has to be a lot of work done in that area. And also, I think we have, back to what Mark had indicated, we have, I guess, underserved or at-risk populations that could dramatically benefit from some of these things. So we need to have all of those people or those voices at the table to really hear what they have to say and really try to shape a future that really works for all of us.
All the voices at the table, I think you've been doing a fantastic job through the Durham Innovation Series that you're running, the different stakeholders that you've brought together. You've brought the voices to the table. But at the end, for someone like KC, whose name I can pronounce, Kalyan Chakravarthy, for someone like KC, you get ultimately bombarded with a lot of questions, but the CISO, for example, or the leads of security report into you, and there's a lot of risk that goes into shifting our current transit mechanisms and deploying sensors and deploying certain smart elements for smart transit. How do you then decide that risk factor? Because at the end, the community is looking at you and then the chair for that decision. How do you rate risk and smart transit?
Okay, so I think with any technology that we deploy or that we develop, that we implement, there is always that element of risk. So it is about where we need to really look at it from three different perspectives. It is about access. Can somebody gain access to this particular device, whether it's IoT or any other smart device that we are putting in? The second that we want to look at is control. Right. Gaining access is one thing. The second piece of it is control. Can somebody control it? And to what extent? And the third and the most important part of it is data, from a data perspective, to say, because when you do the transit, there is a lot of data in it. People look at it from a smart transit, where is it going? Who is riding it? Who is doing what? So all those kind of a thing, what is the kind of data that would be gathered? So that is where we add the protection layer onto it to really look at and say, okay, how can we make it more secure? It is not about that risk will always be there, but how can we minimize the risk? And in case the risk happens, what is the mitigation strategy for us? So developing that is the most important thing, rather than just saying there is a risk, so we would not do it.
As this is a bit of a black box when it comes to smart transit, testing ultimately becomes a very important element of it. I've always been a proponent of the fact that only a foolish person tests the depths of the water with 2 feet. And Chris, you've made sure that we've been going one step at a time. Can you talk to us a little bit about the test beds you've started creating around autonomous vehicles and around smart transit here in Durham region?
Sure, Ali. Thanks. I think what we're looking to do is find areas that are more controlled environments that could be used to test this technology. Certainly, with some of our partners, have amazing sort of test beds within that automotive center of excellence that's at Ontario Tech. We're looking then to move out into maybe parks and other areas such as that, maybe controlled roadways where companies that actually have this technology could, in a very controlled way, start to actually put them into play, see how things work. We can learn for that. And we have an interesting project that, unfortunately, due to COVID, has been delayed a bit, but we certainly are looking forward to it launching the autonomous shuttle project in Whitby. And again, in kind of a controlled area, this shuttle will kind of make its way through a prescribed route up to the GO station, and we're really looking forward to seeing that, seeing how it works, understanding what the different challenges are, and learning from that.
This aspect of challenges ultimately brings us to the question of infrastructure. For example, the project that you're doing or about to roll out in Whitby requires infrastructure, requires roads, requires connectivity, 5G being a good example, requires a lot of public sector and private sector partners to come to the table. And Mark, not only in your current life in Waterloo, but prior to that in Sarnia and then at Stratford, you've played with Festival Hydro as an example, you've played a fundamental role in bringing public and private sector partners together. When from an infrastructure standpoint, would you say that we have an infrastructure deficit, or we just have an infrastructure lack in that we don't understand how to deploy our infrastructure better?
So, Ali, that's a wonderful segue. So I have a lot of concerns right now around the way that we're not rethinking this fundamental shift. We live on infrastructure debt, and I'm concerned that what will end up happening is we'll overlook some obvious things. So before what I said that they don't realize they're a computer industry, if you look at the control area network inside of a vehicle, the CAN bus, it's essentially just traffic, the same as any other network. And the supply chain is both proprietary and territorial about it, to the point where it's difficult to make progress. And we're starting to see some standards come through. Ford is a good example of having a standard communication. They publish the way that it works. But we're not thinking about what the end state looks like. We're thinking about what the next test looks like. We're thinking about what that might do for this one community we're working on. And there's a ton of infrastructure debt, but we shouldn't rebuild it the way it was built. We should consider what that end state is and then start heading in that direction, even though it will be slightly uncomfortable and we don't have the funding, and we need to have a conversation about that to figure out where the right direction to head is.
This aspect of vendor management and the tools and infrastructure that we use, again, goes back to the aspect of risk and how much we're actually going to, whatever we buy, we need to know what the kill switches are, we need to know how we're going to control it, we need to know what that code of ethics is, something that the CISOs yesterday at CISOX were talking about a great deal. And Kalyan, I know this from my experience when I call, you'll pick up at all times, and you've never really dealt with vendors as vendors, you've also, much like Mark, looked at partners. But in this state, when you're moving something like transit, as Mark alluded to, is that with more and more data, we're empowering autonomous vehicles, smart mobility devices to make decisions that could impact from not just a life and death perspective, but a social perspective, could impact jobs, etc. As you're getting targeted by so many vendors on different IoT-based products, specifically around mobility, how has your yardstick shifted and how are you assessing the quality of what's coming to you?
I think what is happening is there are a lot of small players that are working in this kind of a space to really look at and say, we can provide this service from point A to point B. But like what we are looking when we're looking at a partnership is like we are looking at a wider range of things to really say, what is the platform that we'll build on? Like whether it's a smart community, smart city, wherever it is, we need to have a platform. And like I call it as the enterprise bus, or like for the lack of better word, like I treat it like the extension cord where you plug in everything. That is the power cards that is there. So you need to have that, and then you power the devices that is there, so that like you have one single point of entry, and like the data can be distributed. Then you're looking at like, because it's not just about doing a smart city or like doing a smart community or it is a smart transit, but like how can you really consolidate this data into one single platform so that like you can analyze, you can report, you can learn. It is always about, the smart thing is always a continuous learning exercise that like you go through, that like you collect, you do it once, you know that like these are the things that like there are the new challenges. How do you take those challenges, interpret it through that data, and find the solutions, and then implement them back into it?
Implementation of solutions ultimately comes down to the piece of context. And Chris, you've not only been engaging with the municipality and Casey's team, you've been engaging with smaller municipalities as well on this aspect of smart transit and looking at how we can innovate from a data perspective. Are you noticing that some communities are more receptive to it, whilst others are a little worried about the impact of these smart devices, let's say, on our human interactions and our, for example, our relations with our union? How risky has it been to go and propose solutions around smart transit, not just in Durham region? You've been working in Coburg and other smaller communities as well. Chris?
A really interesting perspective on that, and I would say we're seeing really wide variety of reactions to all of this. And one of the questions that frequently comes up as we have these discussions is, what do we need to do to be ready for this technology? And I used to think that was a good question. What I'm really seeing more and more now is I don't think that's a particularly useful question, because like the current situation we're in now, and as we sort of come out of COVID and we talk about post-COVID and that, we know that no one on the planet actually knows what's going to happen in the next 30, 90, 60 days. They don't. And I think it's fair to say with this technology, we don't either. It's moving at an exponential pace. New sort of capabilities come up daily, weekly, or whatever. And what I feel really highlights or identifies the leaders in this area, municipalities, are the ones that are asking themselves, what do we want? What sort of a community do we want? What do we want to see? What are our current challenges, maybe with, again, disadvantaged populations, could be seniors, persons with disabilities who have these mobility challenges, and how could we engage the innovative community to propose potential solutions so that we get what we want? And I think that's probably how I start to now identify the leaders. They're the ones really thinking that way.
Yeah. There's a fine line between profit and prosperity, and a lot of folks that are interested in getting into the space ultimately are driven by a profit motive, to sell you something that works great, and then they provide support on top of it. They don't necessarily think about the contextual elements. And I want to come back to Mark about this. And Mark, you and I were having a discussion a couple of years ago at the Orion conference where I made the statement to you, I don't remember if you recall, we were talking about training and awareness programming in cybersecurity. And I said, look, I'm not of the school of thought that if somebody's hungry, the idea, right? Give them fish and they'll eat for a day. Teach them how to fish and they'll eat for a lifetime. I'm of the opinion of, why is that person in that situation in the first place? And why not feed that person and make them strong enough to then learn how to do other things besides just fish? There are other lacks and deficits. You've been a huge proponent of the fact that not only is there an infrastructure deficit, there is a talent misuse. We don't quite know who needs to be at the table when we're talking smart transit. Can you comment a little bit on this?
I can. So I think one of the things is the maturity level at the institutions that will propose that they should govern this. Often a CIO may not be involved in a project until a server needs to be bought.
Casey knows all too well. Many times I've done projects and he comes to know at the delivery date. But anyway, separate topic. Go ahead.
So I think there's that part. And then the other part is that you're asking people to change. And it takes a long time for everyone to get on board with something that's new. The idea that a car is going to make decisions for me, that it's going to put my brakes on, I might become adverse to that right away. There's an interesting TED Talk about, it's called Bill and Ted's. And it's about the idea that as we automate too many jobs and change the skill set that's required, we're going to ostracize a significant enough part of the population that it might cause real civil unrest. Yeah. And I think about a year ago, Lou Zaccarilla from the Intelligent Community Forum was speaking at a municipality I was working at the time, and he said, the factory is not coming back. And if it does, they're coming back with robots. And while there will be jobs to operate those robots, it's going to require an incredibly different and higher level of skill. And the local institution that trains those skills will be so overwhelmed that those jobs won't really be fillable. So there's a lot of reasons why we'll have adversity against this change. And I think that that might negatively impact the security, because what no one's talking about right now is who should run the network for vehicle-to-vehicle communication and infrastructure-to-vehicle communication. Whose responsibility is it to own and secure and standardize how that works? We might just leave it up to the manufacturers while we're talking about something else.
Absolutely. In that same TED Talk, one of the lessons that you get from that is we've been so fixated with automating the process, we've forgotten to appreciate the person and to augment the people behind everything that we do today. Thank you for bringing that up. And if you get a moment, please post the link to that talk on siberexchange.ca. I highly, highly recommend it, along with all of the wonderful content that you see running live. Casey, on that same vein that Mark brought up on this cautionary note, I've noticed one element of you is when it comes to from a security perspective, you've always been proactive as opposed to reactive. And you've been careful about what ideas you bring out to the public and what you don't. Is this coming from a point of you realize the more you share, the more exposed you become, and there's a little bit of a nervousness over how much you can control when you roll out smart transit?
I think it is not about nervousness to really, the more you share, the more you can't control, but like it is about doing it iteratively, like, and where we have to take baby steps, like we can't really change it. Like even during the COVID, one thing that like we have learned is, like first day one after the COVID, like when people started doing remote working, Teams or like any virtual conferences, like where like first time, they were uncomfortable. They don't know what to do. What are the do's, what were the don'ts, how you can interact, how you can be effective. But as the days progress, today, people are very comfortable having these kind of conversations. Yeah. They know what to do and what not to do. So it is that like iterative way of bringing to people, because I believe that like if you inundate people with information, they might be missing the point that you're trying to make. So give it to them in pieces, make them learn through, like it is going through grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and then graduating rather than just giving the graduation material.
Fantastic. And speaking of this aspect of graduation material, I'll come back to Mark and sort of take us back into undergrad level, where we always think about the time that we're in and the shifts in epochs, the shifts in history, and the shifts in political contexts. The attack landscape has significantly multiplied. I've said this to many people that not only do we look different, the mirrors have changed as well. The mirrors are different. We're seeing the increase of ransomware, of phishing attacks, so on and so forth. Do you think from your perspective, given all of the alerts that you've flagged, that the pandemic now makes it even more riskier, if not makes us more nervous, but makes it more riskier when we engage in smart transit projects?
So I wanted to just comment on something you ended with last time was, let's not automate baking cakes or writing music, right? Yeah. Let's remember that there's things we want to do, even if we're not as good at it as a robot is. Let's not take that fun out of being human. But to speak to your point about threat landscape, I think it's quite large already. We have a lot of automation in our industrial control systems that, again, we pretend aren't computers. And probably there will be an attack of some kind, and we've seen a few grid attacks. Something might happen that none of us imagined, and I'm concerned that the threat landscape is wide and broad, and sure, we can expand it and make it worse, but it's already pretty bad. And I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from looking at what's already there, and it really isn't technology. The problem isn't technology. It's governance and management, who's in charge of it, how we look at it, and how we think about securing it, right? So think of all of the effort you would go to put cameras in your building and guard your perimeter. But more and more, your perimeter is not in your building anymore. Yep. I think on an earlier siberX panel, someone said something that I liked a lot, which was identity is the new perimeter.
That was Bill Harmer, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I liked that a lot. And I think that's what we need to consider is identity of what? Identity of the IoT device? Okay, yep. How are we sure that's what it is and that's what it wants to do? I think that's the right path to go here.
Absolutely. And speaking of Bill Harmer, when I did my Power Hour discussion with him, we sort of began with the idea of I think, therefore I am. And then we went on to explain that in this new perimeter, it's I connect, therefore I am, but I am what? And that really was that aspect of how do you authenticate, but not just let somebody into your perimeter, but what are they doing within that perimeter? I will come back to that as I've seen a couple of questions coming around security practices, security as a service, and software-defined security networks. So we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. Chris, this aspect of governance, and making sure that from a privacy perspective, we have things in place. I've always maintained this, and I was sort of backed by Cat Coot when he said, look, privacy isn't about I have something to hide, it's just I have something to protect. But in an applied research environment, in an environment you're being judged by, and I mean judged quite literally, by the products that we put out there, the prototypes that we're able to execute on. Do you have the time to even have the discussions around privacy frameworks and governance frameworks, or is it all about get the product out and we'll deal with the rest later?
That's a really interesting question, and I think maybe it goes back to something I said earlier about we don't know what the future actually holds. And I think what it really is driving is fundamentally a shift in attitudes like that, in the way we handle things. And funny you mentioned TED Talks. I happened to see one the other day that made the point that we're moving from what was a complicated world to complexity. And in other words, we not only don't we know now, we can't predict and use the same trending models. And they said, well, we can't then sort of, I guess, plan out how we might respond to these things, but we can prepare. And as I've come into these two spaces and learned about the whole cybersecurity from people like yourself and the siberXchange and others, and the privacy side from Dr. Ankavukian, what I'm starting to see is, in my mind anyway, is a shift in how we have to think about this. And so these notions of, say, things like design or privacy by design, security by design, I think we're going to have to start to modify our approaches in these things, because I guess in the end of it, it's an interesting question in how we develop things. I don't think kind of shooting from the hip and just letting the technology run the way we have had is really an option anymore. The downside is too great. And so we're going to have to modify how we do things. And again, just to close this off, the notion of being sure on these aspects versus trying to be efficient is probably actually going to be something that we see as a change in mindset, that we have to make sure the end result it does respect privacy, is secure, versus just driving pure efficiency and then worrying about it as an afterthought.
Thank you for that. And speaking of this idea of how products are created and how they're brought to market, I do recommend to everyone, if you get the chance, Chris is leading the Durham Innovation Series, and I think the next session is on September 10th, completely free to attend. I highly recommend you join those, because you get the perspective from product developers. You get the perspective from the companies that partner with Chris in terms of how they're moving forward. So I highly recommend, if you have the time, that you consider joining. We've got another 25 odd minutes, and Kalyan, I want to bring the conversation back to you, because you mentioned something which, I think Abbas Hirji from CISO for Microsoft out in Melbourne also said, is that it's no longer a Chief Information Security Officer, it's the Chief Intelligence Security Officer. And the CISO, the CIO are now at the table with the CEOs. The CEO is kind of looking to make money, and the CISO is kind of saying, listen, that's great, I'm going to show you how not to lose money. You are playing an instrumental part in the competitive element and edge for Durham region. You're the poster child for Invest Durham on many events. You speak eloquently about how we can remain competitive from an IT perspective. This question has come in slightly sensitive, so we can dodge it if you will, and feel free to tell me. But I'll ask it nonetheless, in the spirit of democratizing cybersecurity. And that is this aspect of with the shutting down of GM and the identity of Durham region as being an autonomous, not necessarily an autonomous vehicle community, but you're going to take it there, Chris, and you already are. But being a town with cars and vehicles and innovation when it comes to transport, has that pushed you to urgently look at more innovations in autonomous vehicles, or is that something that doesn't really factor into the work that you're doing?
Thank you for giving me the option that like I can dodge it. But like I'll try to answer it. Like I think it might be playing in like most of our people from the transit executives, but definitely irrespective of like what it is, like it is still the intent from the region is to how can we bring technology to the people so that like they can really take advantage of these things, whether it is in a social services setting, whether it is in a transit setting, or in the health setting. So irrespective of like whether we are a GM town or like we are place of the GM or like any other thing, that doesn't dictate what we need to put in, because like I feel that like these are different aspects of it. So just identifying that as the only factor, I think it really brings down the value of the other things that we are doing. So that's where like I would say
Absolutely.
that like that might be a factor that is playing as inherently it might be at the back of the mind of most of our transit execs, but the focus is always on how can we really bring it to the people? How can we use this smart transit? Whether and like I'm taking transit as an example here because that's the topic that we're talking, but like it can be applied in a social services setting, in a health setting, in a traffic setting as well. So it is to how can we use the resources that we have to benefit the people and give it to them, in a simpler words, more bang for their buck.
Absolutely, and I think that aspect of giving people a reason to invest in a community or participate in a community is not just about, hey, come here and drop some money and let's see it multiply. It's about join us, participate in the process, and let's grow together. Not everything is just a here's the check, now make it happen. And I really appreciate that aspect because often as public sector, myself, all of us here just to some degree, we're often seen as the ones who's like, we have a problem, give us some money and we'll figure it out. But in this case, it's about, let's have a conversation and then understand what's the best way to move forward. And I'm going to take a similar question and rephrase it for you, Mark, is understanding the stakeholders. And I want to talk a little bit about a specific stakeholder, which is our seniors, especially in rural communities. If it's not broken, what's there to fix? How do you approach this aspect where there isn't any apparent problem with the transit system, but you want to introduce something new? You want to introduce something smarter. You want to introduce something that's more digitized. How do you go about with that stakeholder engagement to ensure you have the buy-in and the trust with which to move forward?
So I kind of want to address two things with that. The first is, you're right. You could say if it's not broken, don't fix it. But if you look throughout history and compare our standard of living here, we are all the wealthiest, if you go back farther, because we've democratized things through technology. So maybe someone just graduating college right now has no hope of buying a car in downtown Toronto. But what if they don't need to own it? What if they can just use it whenever they need to? And what if it doesn't require a driver? And everything you do here is lowering the barrier to entry. And I think that changes the world in a way that impacts everyone positively. Maybe it's just that the granddaughter can go visit the senior in a rural area without an issue. Maybe that's the life-changing thing. Or maybe it's that they can have independence longer in their life, and it isn't so expensive that only the rich can afford it. The other thing I wanted to talk about, which is only sort of related to your question, is something Chris mentioned, was moving from something complicated to something complex. And I want to give an example that isn't related to vehicles, but I'll explain how that matters. So think about moving to an online election process. So what are we doing? We're going to automate the voting. And lots of cities are doing this. And I had some discussions with some friends of mine when we were doing this at one of the municipalities that I worked. And some people were very opposed to it. So why were they opposed to it? And it's because they didn't understand. So how could an online election be hacked? And the answer is we don't know, really, because we can't audit the process. When you have ballots, you show up at a building, you write it down, it goes into a box, someone takes that box and they bring it to a place and someone counts it. Every step of the way you can imagine, how would I hack that, right? I would stuff the ballot box, I would lose votes, I would record the wrong thing, I would, mess with the process, I would go twice. And so you can imagine, because you can understand and you can fit it in your head. But when we move towards a system like an autonomous vehicle, it is so complex that not only can no one understand it, not even one company can build it, and not even one worker at that company could understand the one piece that they're building because of its complexity. So again, I get back to the controls, because you have to treat it like it's a black box. this is what I expected to do in this scenario, and run all of the scenarios you could possibly imagine to test it. And that's where you're going to get, we're sure it's safe, and then you can go to the granddaughter going to visit her grandmother in a rural area without thinking about it and knowing that it's safe.
Safety and knowing something is safe ultimately comes from repeated testing, right? Success, as Pally says, is not an accident. You have to look at, as Stan Lowe said yesterday, is that if the only way through a locked door is through an open window, and you have to find all of those blind spots. Chris, as you're working with all of these companies, and you are having these discussions now by virtue of being affiliated with the Center for Cybersecurity Innovation, you're having these conversations at a nascent level, but you're making it more forefront around security, so on and so forth. What is the reception like when you say whatever we create, which is software defined primarily, and you ask them, hey, let's pen test some of these environments? What's the reception that you're getting? Because I know you've had a couple of conversations and said, I'll bring my mate Ali into the conversation, and then the calendar invite gets rejected.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It kind of picks up on, I think, what some of Mark and Caleb were really saying. And I think, to me, this is an area that really identifies and showcases the value of what, say, colleges do with applied research. This area of being able, in a very applied way, to take this technology and put it into different scenarios, different environments, different use cases. Because fundamentally, what we need is to test this stuff out and do it in a controlled way to really start to understand things. And I think we probably get two reactions back to your initial question. I think in areas where it's not really well understood, the security aspect in that, then maybe there's not as, I would say, an open receptivity to doing that sort of stuff. People are wondering why. Can we just maybe couple a few things together and make an Internet of Things type device and sensors, and it would work? And I guess, too, before I got educated in all of this, I might have thought that as well. But I started to realize that a lot of this stuff is built on legacy technology. And again, back to this notion of security by design, it's not there. And by doing that sort of stuff, we open ourselves up. When you talk to those that are educated in this, I'm seeing more and more really strong push for security being built in, again, security by design. And so, it's probably an educational process, but I'm seeing it move fairly rapidly, and I think the appreciation of the need for security is moving quickly, and I think is being understood more and more by more people.
Security by design ultimately comes down then to the technical security practices that we deploy. And since we've been talking a great deal about governance and policies when you deploy a piece of technology, I'm going to bring a question to Mark, and then I'll come back to Casey. And Mark, you and I, when we had our power, not only did we say we didn't allude to identity being the new perimeter, we just simply said the perimeter is dead as we know of it. But zero trust access was something that you highlighted a great deal, and I responded back by saying, zero trust doesn't necessarily mean zero faith. It just means that you need to identify yourself, and we will only allow you to conduct yourself once you've been identified and authenticated. Doesn't mean we don't have faith in people. However, how do you build trust in the community? How do you build buy-in in the community if we take a security posture which is primarily driven by zero trust? And especially now, as people are worried about how governments are using our data, what sharing is happening. I think even with the contact tracing apps, and I don't subscribe to any theories from the far left, but there are theories and notions that suggest that the more and more we start to digitize services, especially transit, which we rely on, the more and more we're giving away. How do you manage transit in a zero trust environment?
So I think the first thing is, you trust the people. It's the tool that you put the zero trust on, because the person who's riding would typically have no malicious intent. The malicious actor is someone who might do something bad to that vehicle while it's in motion, or something else you alluded to. And I mentioned that I enjoyed Edward Snowden's book, and so I'm very close to his age, so I relate a lot to some of the anecdotal stories in there. And it's true that I'm probably the last generation that could get in a vehicle that isn't a computer and drive somewhere and no one knows where I am. It's literally not possible to know where I am or where I've been, and there's no digital history of every step that I've taken. As a side, I remember when my wife and I were dating, she was coming to visit me in Hamilton. I'd recently relocated there for a co-op position, and we didn't have cell phones. There was no texting. There was no, I was at work, and she had missed her transfer, so she took a cab from London to Hamilton, because the only other outcome would be that I'd be waiting at the terminal, and for who knows how long, right? So there's that you don't know where someone is. And the reason I'm emphasizing on that is because these vehicles will be collecting a lot of information about us.
Yeah.
And the right way to do trust is through transparency. So the COVID tracing app is perfect. It's open source. Go look at it. You can audit it. You can do whatever the heck you want. You can modify it and reload it. So having that level of transparency when it's practical, because sometimes obscurity is going to be required for a bunch of business or security reasons. But I think being very transparent about what the process does whenever we can, and letting the person know that when we're talking about zero trust, it's not they that aren't trusted,
Right.
it's the tool.
A very important point that you bring up, because one of our speakers towards the latter half of the day in the discussions that we're going to have about security and smart communities, lessons from Canada and the Caribbean, talking about Canada is going to be Terry Cutler. And when he was discussing a site called, I think it's called You Got Pwned, where you can check if you've been part of any data breaches or your data has been leaked, he said, look, you know what, go and look at who's writing the scripts to this application. Somebody from Microsoft. There's a legit trace of who this individual is. You need to make it transparent in terms of what are the minds behind a particular tool. So I really like that relationship between the COVID app, and I do encourage you, when you get a chance, to watch the rerun of Ann Cavoukian's talk on day one. It speaks a little bit to this. We've got another 12-odd minutes left, and I want to come back to Casey in terms of his engagements with the community and his engagements with the municipality. This aspect of the threats that are facing IoT-driven devices is not something that will become apparent to us once the autonomous shuttle program is up and running. We're seeing it in our region, where carjacking is happening with the ability to infrared signals from the automated remote controls to your car that are sitting at your door to your car. Have you started any awareness campaign programs around smart vehicles and what you need to do to keep your vehicles safe in Durham region?
I think it's about, I think you hit the right point, all this, autonomous vehicles or anything, the technology that you're putting in, from the security perspective and a zero trust, it is about digital literacy.
Yeah.
And when I say digital literacy, it's not about having, I understand IT, I understand this, or I understand, what an IoT device is.
Correct.
But, there is a literacy for each portion of it. What is that particular device is doing, and how it can be altered or used for multiple purposes, or an unknown or unauthorized use. So those things are, you can't go device by device, whether, I'm taking your example of carjacking, can we educate people about this? No, but it needs to be a campaign that we want to build, to really look at, and digital literacy as a whole, to see these are the set of devices that are coming in, and this is how they can be altered. And going back to the first statement that I made, how can it be gained access to? How can it be controlled? And what is the data that they can take? So I think it is about, if we constantly, from the public perspective, constantly look at these three things and ask three questions, the manufacturer is supposed to give you that information.
Yep.
Whoever is selling you that, they are supposed to give that information to you, as well as the information is free. That is the best part of it. The technology that is coming in is the information is at your fingertips. So definitely going by and asking these three questions and knowing that information is a key thing. But coming to us as a region, are we doing it? There might be something happening, not that I am aware of fully, but it is not a question to me, so I would not like to comment on that.
Fantastic. No, but I think it's very important to also realize the critical role now that the CIOs are playing, and the CISOs, not just internal to your municipal governments, but also external to the community. And I will commend you for this. It's a large population in Durham region, and the fact that you are accessible, the fact that they can call you, and the fact that you can respond speaks wonders. So thank you for all of your support. We've got another few more minutes and a few questions, so I'll try and stitch them up as well as I can. Question for you, Mark, and then I'll have Chris. I'll reword it a little bit for you. And Mark, the question that's come in here is, how ready are we to actually from a network security standpoint, monitor and support smart transit. The example suggests that, in any operation system that has a transit, any municipality that operates transit, there is a control room. You're able to track the fleet. You're able to know that it's reached at the right place, etc. Are these control rooms ready enough and agile enough to now engage with the SOC and run their own SOCs? Or are we also going to have challenges there because you're going to have to wrestle some human control now to other very specialist controls? Mark?
So I don't think we're ready, and there's 3 reasons. The first is we'd have to start by assuming that there is a standard method of communication that we can all listen to, and that we're allowed to listen to it, that that's possible. So if that's possible, then what are we doing with that information? Well, we're probably putting it into some kind of system that's aggregating the data that we can do pattern analysis, anomaly detection, and maybe we're sitting someone in front of a computer that's probably already sitting in front of a computer for a different reason looking at something else, and then that person needs to be educated. So that digital literacy piece, so if we assume we get access to the data, that we can watch it, whoever that is.
Right.
And we assume that we have people, we have labor resources to do that work. Now we next have to assume that they have been educated to do so. And people call it IT over here when they don't know how to use it. But no one thinks of Gmail as IT, right? But it is. So what do you do to bridge that gap? Well, you need to not do something as silly as don't trust URLs because they're not working, and don't worry if there's that lockup in the corner, then it's safe. Oh, but no, that's not true because you can't do that to people with this.
Yep. I think this element of you can do this with people ultimately comes to how we engage with people around security. And Chris, I've had a lot of conversations with you about this. Like, for example, we hosted Global Cyber Olympics, where obviously COVID happened, so we couldn't do Enable AI, but we were thinking about some sort of a data hacking environment as well. Are you seeing that you're now being tasked with also looking at environments where you can bring in new talent to sort of test out and run competitions, for example? We were talking a lot about hashing and encryption protocols, etc. Is part of the DCAVR mandate now to also look at competitions that we can create so that we can build not just technical skills from an academic standpoint, but from a practical live standpoint as well, the living lab, so to speak?
I would say yes, more and more, and I think we're seeing even more and more demand for that sort of thing out there. The developers of this technology realize that you can write code and you can write algorithms and that, but ultimately you have to put it into some sort of a use case and environment and run it and test it. And I think the type of facilities that our new Center for Cybersecurity Innovation, the things you've done at the AI Hub, all of those that allow us to spin up test beds, test environments, and make those available through our different applied research activities is really a very critical role in all of this to help these businesses actually commercialize these sort of solutions. Yeah.
I think that aspect of commercializing solutions ultimately goes back to the fact that it's not just about getting it out there. Commercialization implies looking at the governance, implies getting the legal support, implies an entire process. And I think it's very important that we bring that into the equation when we understand securing smart transit. Another 6 more minutes, and I'll take the last question, and then we'll come to concluding remarks. Casey, and this is to you. You've always been a proponent of the fact that, look, and I said this in my keynote as well, that you're just buying it because it's the next shiny thing. It's the next iPhone. You just need to have it. It's only smart if it's got this new device on it. And I maintain this. It's not about how getting the new tools. It's about how you use the tools differently. That's at the core of what we mean by being smart. And this smart communities as a concept doesn't go back to 1993. It goes back to even the partition that we're and today being the independence of India. How do you smartly use land? Or how do you outsmart people in order to get your land? There are many ways you can look at it. You've pointed me to the example of Innisfil, where they replaced transit with Uber. And they were able to then run an Uber service because the cost of transit, a smaller community, was a little too high, and they went down with the Uber mentality, and they built something very different. What's your take on these kind of innovative ways in which transit or public sectors are now engaging the Ubers of the world and the Lyfts of the world? Your perspective?
I think 2 things where there are yes, I agree with you. There are a lot of bright and shiny new toys that are available, and not everything is good for everyone. So you need to really look at what works for you. That's the first thing that you need to look at. And from a security perspective, you are as secure as your weakest link. So focusing on the foundation part of the things is also important. And then third, coming to the innovative ways of like private, like Uber being, I feel that like that is where it is going. The sharing economy is here to stay. So it might be Uber, there might be something, a car sharing that might come in. Like I don't want to suggest on like one company or the other, but like there would be a car sharing where like it would be a private car sharing, where like if right now they are, people who are doing that, but like there would be a platform that might be created that might bring in together, that might really reduce the burden on public transit. And with the working, like remote working coming in, what does the whole transit system looks like? Because people have realized saying that like they're spending at least in the major cities, they're spending at least 2 to 3 hours in transit. So what is it like, how can we make it productive? How can we eliminate it if we can? And are there innovative ways? Because like it is not one person's job. Wherever like it is coming in, you need to embrace that change. And for that, like we need to be opening our eyes to really look at the problem in a different way. Yeah. And assuming that like, okay, pilot it, let's look what it comes in, and then do it in an iterative approach so that like we can learn from what we have implemented.
Fantastic. On that topic of learning, I'll come to you, Chris, and then we'll go to closing remarks with Mark. Chris, I've noticed also now that over the last, and believe it or not, last year we were at CISO Forum, or preparing to go to CISO Forum in a very different world back in BC before Corona, and now we're in a very different environment. But what I've noticed is since our engagements at the CISO Forum, since Global Cyber Olympics and the establishment of the Center for Cyber, you've now realized that autonomous vehicle groups and smart transit security groups and research groups from Germany are starting to found chapters in Ontario, founded a chapter in Windsor, and you're now in talks about some stuff in Durham region. Why do you think there's been a sudden explosion in this area of research, and what are your plans in order to grow such chapters in Durham region?
It's interesting. I think, Ali, one of the maybe silver linings in COVID and as we've gone online is that ability to reach out globally. So we've been on events and that with people from Spain and London and other places in the world. And I think, that is can be leveraged in extremely interesting ways, because now we have people with different voices and expertise and experience that we can learn about here in Durham and really help us. And I think more and more what we need to do is really attract those voices with the different levels of experience, different use cases and that to what our particular circumstances are here and help us learn. And I know one of the things that I would like to see, and this is just from a personal standpoint, is I would really like to see our region embrace the notion of becoming an autonomous vehicle ready zone and really focus on the types of things we need to do, but be mindful of there are near-term challenges right now. So who has that technology that can maybe address the near-term challenges? Again, we talked about mobility challenges with certain populations at risk. But what can we do right now? And then as we continue to do these things, it kind of goes back to some of the things my fellow panelists have talked about. It helps the general public become more and more educated about what this technology is, what it does, a bit more of a comfort level. And we need to do that if we're going to take advantage of this technology, as it arrives.
As it arrives. And we'll work with that a little bit and come to the arrival of our conclusion with Mark and work on a question that I find pretty interesting. And this is this aspect of the reason that we're talking about the security of smart transit is because there's a lot of pressure on our transit system. Now, this is, of course, prior to what we now call the new normal. Let's take Toronto as example, the wait times, etc. The question reads that the data that we're looking at is, are there enough fleet, or is there enough fleet to cover the amount of transport, or the number of people that want to join onto that particular train or that particular bus? The knee-jerk reaction has just been to say, let's just get more trains out there. Let's just get more fleets out. Let's just go and build another LRT. Let's just build another track, and that will solve everything. I know you would agree that that is completely the wrong way to look at it. If we're looking at data on transit, what's one suggestion that you would give people when they're looking at such data?
I think the suggestion is to forget what you think you know. Go back to something simple, like imagine you didn't have what you have. look at this new thing you have. If it didn't have the barriers to work within the existing system, how could you use it? So there was a time when we would sit down and have talks like this, and we talk about, well, who's going to do the insurance when someone gets in an accident? If the car is smart enough to decide which accident it gets in, what's the ethical way to program it to deal with that? If these things are going to be electric, where are they going to charge, and how is it going to work in the grid? But a better way to look at it is, if it does work out, what do you have? A downtown with no one parked on the side of the road. You don't need parking lots anymore. Your whole space can be transferred. And if they're electric, maybe they can go and provide electricity when they're not driving to something. So there's really a reason to rethink it, because you can make your urban space way more beautiful and less stressful to be in.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I know we're out of time, so I will provide some concluding remarks before thanking our panelists. I started off this session by saying, a thought is merely an idea in transit. You need to talk about it, and it'll go through that transit process and become an idea when you share it on panels like this. So I thank siberXchange for making this happen, Town of Ajax for making this happen, and Durham College AVAR team for making this happen. One of the most important lessons that I took from the discussions today was this aspect of that you cannot talk about transportation without getting lost. Lose those parameters that we have about this is how we always get from point A to point B. Let's get lost a little bit, and let's see what we can create and find as new solutions to our transit woes. Thank you all for your time. Thank you, Chris, Mark, and Casey for this amazing chat. I know we could have continued on. To our audience, the next series is going to be with the Town of Ajax, where we're going to be talking about the importance of people power and innovation, and I will be your moderator there as well. Once again, thank you all for your time, and I wish you all a happy Friday, and we'll see you all in 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.